Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for our Violence Intervention Policy panels. My name is Congresswoman Robin Kelly, and I'm proud to represent the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois. I also want to thank my colleagues, my co-chair, Senator Durbin, Senator Blumenthal, and Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, Mike Thompson and Lucy McBath, and other elected officials that will be joining us this evening. I would also like to thank former Secretary of Education Arne Duncan and Leo Smith and Chicago CRED for helping to make this happen. To the panelists here today, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise on combating the public health crisis of gun violence. We know that the work you all do is not for the faint of heart. Communities across this nation mourn those who have been tragically killed by senseless acts of gun violence. I believe we must dig deeper into the root causes of gun violence. The work must begin in our own backyards, reaching out to our youth, giving them opportunities that are meaningful and beneficial to their lives. While many of you who sit on the panels here today are doing exactly that, I think it's important that as members of Congress, we hear more about your work so that we may enact federal violence intervention policies to protect communities who do not have wonderful advocates such as yourselves. Like many of you, I was ecstatic to hear about President Biden's executive order to curb gun violence, which was announced on Friday. The executive order included a gun trafficking report, which, as you know, is something we urgently need to address in Chicagoland. I recently introduced HR 2280, the Prevent Gun Trafficking Act, which would make it a federal crime for store purchasing. In Illinois, we have very strict gun laws to protect our residents, but unfortunately, our neighboring states do not. While we know bills like HR 8 and the Charleston loophole bill will do wonders for our nation once signed into law, it is the everyday gun violence that I've had the unfortunate experience of dealing with in communities in the Illinois 2nd Congressional District. Every life lost to gun violence is a tragedy, and we should make sure that we are working to address the day-to-day violence and not just the mass shootings that make headlines. With community-based intervention programs and investments in opportunity building, I believe our nation can begin healing while saving generations to come. I want to again thank you all for joining us here today, and will now turn it over to my colleague, Jan Schakowsky, for a few words. Jan?
Robin Kelly, you are such a great leader on this issue, a great friend and a great Congresswoman. Thank you for inviting me. Let me also just thank Senators Blumenthal and Durbin, our own senator, for co-hosting this event. You know, we're off to a pretty bad start in Chicago, for example. We have more than 700 Chicagoans have been shot this year. We're only in April, and there were 131 homicides. And I was driving on Lakeshore Drive, one of the main downtown thoroughfares, when a child, 21 months old, was shot while riding in the car of his parent. It was a road rage. Fortunately, though he was shot in the head, he seems to be recovering. So we're not a day too early to discuss the solutions. We are grateful to the president for making executive orders, and I am so looking forward to the panel and learning from you. Never before has there been such a mobilization of people ready to fight to end gun violence. And again, Robin Kelly, you're at the head of the line, and thank you for that. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Jan. Interestingly enough, I met with Shannon Watts today, Moms Demand Action, and she shared with me that 100 of their volunteers ran for office this last election, and 43 won. And that's amazing. And some downstate Illinois, which is definitely progress. So I was happy to hear that. But with that, I'd like to turn it over. I don't think my senators have come yet. So I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Arne Duncan. Arne?
Thank you so much, and to both our congressional leaders. You guys are friends, but much more importantly, you are courageous leaders on this issue and so many others. And we're just thankful here in Chicago and across the state to have both of you working so hard on behalf of our communities. And Congressman Kelly, you said it perfectly. This, gun violence really is a public health crisis, and the similarities to COVID are just striking. They both are transmitted through social networks. Both of them, if left unchecked, they just get more and more deadly, more uncontrolled. Both demand national solutions, national initiatives, because these are national crises. Both always, COVID, gun violence, always impact our most marginalized, our most disenfranchised communities. We can't talk about any of these pandemics or public health crises without talking about race. They always impact Black and brown communities more than they do white communities. But the good news in all of this is we actually know what works in both of these. And so the question is not what do we do, but do we have the courage to do it? And it's something that I think if we commit ourselves to, if we had that courage, in a very dark time. Last year was very violent. This year started worse, as you said, Congresswoman Schakowsky. We're not in a good place. So in a really dark time, I'm actually optimistic. I'm really optimistic because we do know what works. And let me just introduce quickly the panel, and then we'll get right into it, of leaders who are leading our city, leading our state, and ultimately help lead our nation to a much safer place. I want to thank all of them for taking the time to join us. I'll introduce them very briefly in order of how we'll go through the questions. First, Diane Maniker is the founder and president of Kids Off the Block. She works in Roseland, in the heart of the South Side where we work, and her nonprofit empowers young people to be leaders in the community. And she's been going at this work for almost 2 decades. Tiana Lofton is one of my favorite people in the world. She's a college student now, has just been a star in the violence prevention work here in Chicago. Very tragically, she was shot on the day of her drive-through high school graduation. She almost bled out. Nobody came. Her mother eventually came and picked her up and took her to the hospital. We're so lucky she's still with us, but she obviously should never have gone through what she went through, and she's in school now at the University of New Orleans. Eddie Bocanegra is a good friend. Has been just an unbelievable advocate in this work for a long time. He's a senior director at the Heartland Alliance here in Chicago and leads its READY program, which is an amazing partner for us at Chicago CRED. Eddie brings years of experience in community-based organizations and programs that address trauma and build resiliency among those young men and women most impacted by gun violence. Dr. T is one of my teammates. He leads our clinical team of therapists at Chicago CRED. He's devoted his life to helping heal communities, helping to heal people who have been hurt. He works with our partners in terms of trauma care and works on our policy side as well. And then finally, Dr. Andy Papachristos is a professor of sociology at Northwestern University and director of the Northwestern Neighborhood and Network Initiative, N3. He's currently working as a research partner on multiple gun violence prevention efforts across Chicago and across the country. And his advice and input has been just invaluable to us at Chicago CRED. So people can Google other backgrounds and get more information, but it's just an extraordinary team of folks who are working so hard every day to make a difference.
Hey, Arne, before you start, I just wanted to acknowledge my co-host, Senator Dick Durbin is on with us now, and also Senator Blumenthal. Senator Durbin, no pressure. I didn't know if you wanted to say a few words now or wait until after the first panel.
Robin, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good news. Well, listen, I want to thank you for doing this. And boy, you have some great people on here with Arne Duncan and Joe Bocanegra and a number of others that I've come to know. You know, the education of a senator is an awesome task. And I actually learned something a few years ago, which changed my thinking about gun violence. I thought for the longest time, I understood the issue until I went to the Cook County Juvenile Facility and met some of the adolescents there who were charged with gun crimes, serious gun crimes. And you know, if they have to wait for trial, sometimes that's a year or more. So they go to high school at the Cook County Juvenile Facility. And I sat down with their teachers and counselors in a private session. And I said, who are these young people? How did they become members of gangs? How did they become shooters? What's this all about? They said, well, they come from a lot of different backgrounds. A lot of them are tough backgrounds and tough family situations. But there's one thing that over 90% of them have in common. They have been victims of trauma, what we call adverse childhood experiences. and many of those experiences change their lives because nobody's there to help them get back on track. And so I've really been focused on trying to figure out ways to address trauma. I know Eddie does too. He was on the panel that's going to be entertaining all these questions. And what we're trying to do now is to work with the Chicago hospitals. I've talked to Arne about it. He's met with them too. The 10 major hospitals have all decided that they're going to do something outside the walls of their hospitals, reaching out in the community, hiring more people from the neighborhoods, doing their best to make sure that their materials and supplies come from the neighborhood, and reaching out in the neighborhoods in a public health effort. I really think we've got to bring it down to that level. And if you ask me, I'll just say, Robin, if we had counselors in schools who seriously knew how to sit down and talk to kids who were in a troubled situation and could do it at an early age, I think we'd see a dramatic change in what happens to the lives of some of these young people. So put me down on the list for not only making sure we have the right kind of law enforcement, but to make sure we have the right kind of helping hands for young people and their families who have lived through this trauma. I think that's an important element.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Blumenthal, do you have a few words?
I'm really proud to be a partner of Dick Durbin's in this fight against of yours too, Congresswoman Kelly, and of Jan Schakowsky, two really wonderful leaders. And Arne Duncan, has been such a tremendous fighter for young people, whether it's on the basketball court or in the halls of the Department of Education. I sort of feel like I've cracked the Chicago club here. And the leadership that's coming from your city is extraordinary. But let me just say, this is a national problem. I've been fighting gun violence since I was elected Attorney General in 1990. I've gone to court. I've been in our legislature and now in the United States Congress. And I sort of feel this time is different because we have momentum at the grassroots level. The folks on this call and others who are looking to you for leadership, and you're providing it, are part of a growing political movement that has elected members of Congress who are committed to this cause. Since 2018, we've been electing members to Congress who proactively advance this issue. Now we have a president who's passionate and clearly committed, and potentially both houses of Congress voting on this issue for common sense steps against gun violence. And Dick Durbin is absolutely right. We need to look at the trauma. It's not just the killings, as horrific and tragic as they are, but every day, literally, kids watch killings. It happened just over the weekend. In fact, the killing of a 3-year-old in front of his family. That family is changed forever. And the rippling effects of gun violence are astronomical in their costs, emotional costs, financial costs, human costs. So that's why I have been and will continue to fight for this cause, and why I really so appreciate your leadership. And thank you all for all you are doing day in and day out. Thank you.
And Arne, I was just asked to let people know that the speaker view is not working. So if you're not on the first panel and you don't want to be on, you can turn your camera off. And now back to you.
We're also happy to see everybody. And I just really want to thank both senators. Senator Durbin's just been an unbelievable champion for our men and for our city and for our state. He's come out and met with our guys and always does it with unbelievable humility and spends a lot more time listening than he does talking. So Senator, thank you for your leadership and friendship. And for Senator Blumenthal, I know how personal this is. President Obama's worst day in office, my worst day in DC, and President Obama obviously dealt with the hardest issues on the planet by definition, was the day of the massacre at Sandy Hook. And in our worst nightmares, we never imagined 20 babies and 5 teachers and a principal being killed. And President Obama went down the next day. Then Vice President Biden, now President Biden, and I went down a couple of days later, and meeting with those families and meeting with the younger siblings. And it's just an experience that none of us will ever forget. And so This is a national issue. It's an acute crisis here in Chicago, but it's not unique to Chicago. And across the country, we have to get to a better place, and we need all of your leadership and partnership. So thank you for taking the time. We'll get right to our panel now. Let's start with Diane. And Diane, for folks that may not be from Chicago, may not know the South Side, may not know what Roseland's like, please talk about, just in very real terms, I always want to just be real and honest with folks, how does gun violence impact the young people that you serve? And what do you try to do to address the trauma that our young people are experiencing, unfortunately, almost on a daily basis?
Well, first, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be here. Second, let me say I agree with Senator Dick Durbin. That's how it affects the young people I serve, the trauma. They're coming from trauma. They're born into trauma. And then they have to live it in their environment. And they bring it to wherever they come, even to our center around me. And it's devastating because it affects all of them. They bring it to each other. And that's how the gangs exist, because there's so much of it. Each one of them is carrying something. And they have a bone to pick with everybody because they're angry. And they tell you about it. And they cry about it because a lot of them don't want to carry the baggage. How we deal with them is, well, first of all, we deal with it through love and care and understanding. But we also deal with it with the fact that what do they need to help with the trauma? How can we help them to release and to see that there is hope and that there is a better life? And that comes from helping in their environment. Now, my takeaway from this is that, yeah, we've got to deal with the trauma, but we've got to deal with the issue of trauma. And the issue is our communities. My community is not unique. It's across the country. Every community that's like mine is dealing with the same thing. And that's racism, that's disinvestment, that's schools. And I'm preaching to the choir here, I know. But I just want you all to know the people like me who are on the ground see what's happening. We know what needs to be done. And we need our communities empowered to do it.
Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for staying with us, work. And most importantly, thanks for working with so many of our young people. It's just interesting. We have a set of young people working with us now, Chicago CRED, who have come through your program. And they got in a fight the other day. Who are you the real aunt for? I'm not sure you're the real aunt for any of them, but they were all claiming you. Just sort of lets me know how much you've made a difference in their lives. It was a really interesting conversation, pretty funny to listen to. Let me go to Tiana, and I don't want to get emotional here, but I've known Tiana for a few years now, and she's just been an absolute superstar. I don't say that lightly, in the gun violence prevention movement. She's brilliant. She's outspoken. She's clear. We've had summer jobs programs, peacemakers, peace warriors programs across the city that she's participated on. And again, and I'll let Tiana, maybe two things, maybe just say what happened to you despite all of that, how you're doing. And then my question would be is if, and it's a big if we get the kinds of national resources that the political leaders on this call are talking about and President Biden is championing, far too often we don't ask young people what we should do with those resources. We just tell them what we're going to do with it. But first, maybe just let folks know your personal journey, your story, how you're doing today. And then if we are able to get significant resources for the country, and yes, some for Chicago, how would you like to see those resources spent? But start on the personal side first, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tiana Lofton, and like Mr. Duncan said, I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I stay in Auburn Gresham on the south side of Chicago. I have been working at St. Sabina for a little over 3 years. So I was working with the gun violence prevention for about 3 years. But unfortunately, last year I did get shot on the day that the looting broke out for George Floyd. Standing outside of a gas station. That's right around the corner from my house. Long story short, I got hit in my main artery in my left arm. Since it was the busy day with George Floyd, when I called out for police, they actually never came. Luckily enough, my mom came to me in time, and we was able to get to Little Company of Mary, where I had to get a blood transfusion and Yeah, after a little over 2 hours being there, I immediately got transferred to Christ Hospital, where I went into emergency surgery to put a rubber tube in my arm to get the blood flow going to my hand. And then a couple hours after that, I went to another surgery to replace a vein from my left leg, to go into my left arm to be the be the way that the blood flow to my hand. Now, since then, I have attended occupational therapy in Chicago. I attended that for about 8 months until this January, where I came and attended the University of New Orleans. I now attend the University of New Orleans, doing very well. My hand is still, I'm still doing my healing process. It haven't been a year yet. Next month, make it a year, but I mean, I'm good where I'm at. One thing I can say is thank you, Mr. Duncan, for everything you have done for me from that point on. Because one thing I had noticed was I was speaking out against gun violence and speaking for people that was getting shot in my community, but I had never been through it. So I never really knew what happened after when you got shot. When I got shot, I noticed that my community have no resources for the young people. When I got shot, I live in Urban Gresham. A young person gets shot at least every 2 minutes in my community, yet it's not a trauma unit within 10 minutes. I was able to make it to Little Company of Mary, which is about 15 minutes away if you put it in the GPS. After a blood transfusion and other things, I was finally able to get an ambulance to transfer me to Christ, which, is farther in Evergreen Park. I feel that if my community had more resources like trauma units, even better hospitals, or things like mental health homes for a person who even shot me, young people like that, because like one of you stated, this things affect what happens around you, the young people, things around you. So no one wakes up and say, hey, I'm going to go shoot someone today. I want to kill somebody. That's not what happened. You have to go through the trauma. You have to go through the pain and feel the revenge to want to get up and be like that. And the fact that it's so many young people that have the courage to kill is an issue, and that is a mental health disease. And the fact that my community have no mental health homes, or even not a free one in sight, is an issue for the young people, and even when we get older, because you don't get help as you're young, so it just continues. Like I just want to say, the reason I am here now at my university is because people like Arne Duncan and the people at St. Sabina and the ones who reached out like you all, to help me keep going. If it wasn't people like you, there's honestly nothing in Chicago to keep the young people going. It's like a blockage. And I just want to say, if we had more resources, more things to start us when we're young, more just rec centers, a health home, that will be fun. Like someone said, having counselors in the school that actually care, not the counselors that go to the students that have the form, but that go to the students that don't get the attention that they need. Just starting with the young people and just putting resources everywhere, and not in good communities that can afford it, I guess. Everyone deserves a chance, and so everyone deserves the same thing. Putting it out there. One thing I also want to say, when young people are involved in things in the youth, it's very hard to get out, and money is an issue. I was blessed to have people around me and my dad be able to afford my medical bills and my occupational therapy and stuff. But if I didn't have that, I don't know who will be able to do that. And that's just me. So think about young people who don't have adults around, or don't have people like Mr. Duncan to come and give them the helping hand. What happens to them? Or who helps them? And I understand why they fall back into a pattern of violence and revenge, because it's nothing else to look forward to. And so just giving young people something to look forward to, spreading it everywhere, I think, could just, make a big difference. Not even just in Chicago, but everywhere. And just kind of all I have to say. Thank you again, Mr. Duncan, for this opportunity, and thank you everyone else for what you are doing.
Tiana, one quick follow-up. And one thing that we learn painfully every day that is painful literally as the physical injuries are, and you're still dealing with the physical injuries, it's often much harder emotionally and mentally. And I know you went through a pretty dark time after getting shot. I just want to sort of check how you're doing emotionally now, how you're doing mentally.
Yeah, actually, so my shooting did held off my college plans. I was planning to attend LSU in the fall, but that all changed once I got shot, because I am left-handed, and so that was my lefty that got injured, and so it just stopped all of the college plans. I just want to how can I say this? I'm sorry, sir. Can you ask your question again?
Yeah, just how are you doing now emotionally?
Emotionally, I want to say, in September, that's where I was getting to. In September, I actually had got a therapist through CRED, which I want to say helped me come to the realization that things happen, and sometimes it's okay to work and try to get over it, and not saying to get over it, but like sometimes you just have to live with things. And so yes, I do still have this injuries now, like I have nerve damage from my shooting, but like I said, I'm here now, and I mean I'm well enough to keep going, so I'm not complaining on my end. I think just to give kids that courage that it's okay to keep going, and that losses are okay. Sometimes you have to take a lesson learned, and sometimes it's okay to fall, but it's just as long as you keep going. And so to give like kids that courage and that knowledge, like keep going, it's all right to fall. I think that is what kind of helped me personally keep going. So
Thank you so much, and you will keep going. We're all going to be working for you someday, so we'll be sending you resumes when we're done with this call.
Thank you, sir.
Let me shift to Eddie, and we all do this work for very personal reasons, and Eddie's story is pretty unbelievable. And unfortunately, he is a young man as a teen was caught in cycles of violence and took a life and spent time and has devoted his life to giving back and helping communities heal, and has just been a warrior and a hero and a champion in this work. And Eddie, just for you, going back to your teenage years, and then last week being at the White House at the Rose Garden for President Biden's announcement, I can only imagine, or try and imagine, what you're thinking as you were sitting there. If you just sort of let folks know what was going through your head last week at that ceremony.
Yeah, well, Arne, thanks so much for the opportunity. A lot that I could say, limited time, but here's what I would say, that, a group of advocates, one being Pastor Mike, who's also on this call, and others, have been really pushing forward for this $5 billion request for the president. And at the very beginning, I was just like, that's a pipe dream. And as we started meeting with Ambassador Susan Rice and other White House officials, I started realizing how realistic and probable this could be. Sure enough, being invited by the president to attend last week's announcement, to sit at the Rose Garden, made me reflect in terms of how far I've come in my life, and to be able to carry the people with me as well. The people that have suffered, the victims in my case, my family who serve in the armed forces, people that I constantly, unfortunately, have to bury. We've lost 34 men within the program already in Chicago. Despite those losses, we still are seeing really positive results. At the end of the day, as somebody who's been formerly incarcerated, somebody who's experienced a share of violence and trauma in my life, it just felt really good to be in that space, Arne. And I just, on behalf of all those who are advocating, those who are on this call, I want to thank you. And I want to thank you simply for this other reason. At the end of the day, when I first started my work, I think about just 9 years ago, I was actually in Congresswoman Schakowsky's house. I was an intern at ICER, working on immigration issues, drawing the parallel between those who are being detained through ICE and those who are currently detained in our prison system, and drawing the connection there. And while she might not remember me, I remember her in her house, a beautiful place. And I think about just recently too, just a couple of years ago with Congresswoman Robin Kelly as well, speaking in front of Congress about these very same issues that we're speaking about today. And how can I forget also Senator Durbin, right, who's been an ally, instrumental in the work that we do, and someone who's visited the program, someone that I've had lunch with. And I can't speak enough about just the advocacy of three leaders here, among others, right, that I've got to know very personally. And that includes you also, Arne, someone who's been in the forefront pushing for more resources in this space. And that is what we truly need. We need more political will behind the work that we're doing. And so I just want to take a moment to say thank you for that as well.
And just a quick follow-up, and I think it's so important for folks to understand our world is not black and white. We live in a world of tremendous gray. And there are probably folks who, given what you did as a teen, might say, lock him up forever, throw away the key, don't give him another chance. And I know that we can't get to a safer Chicago, we can't get to a safer country without the leadership of you and others who have been in these cycles of violence but have escaped them. And your lived experience is so critical for other young men and women to benefit from. And so if you could maybe just give a sense, not just of your own story, but just let folks know about, is transformation possible? Is hope possible? Why is it so important for folks like you to be at the forefront, to be leading this fight and not somehow excluded or shunned or whatever that might be?
Yeah, great question, Arne. At the end of the day, there is so much talent that is coming home, that are coming home from prison. There's so much talent and skills and beyond a story, right? Beyond a narrative for those who've encountered harm, such as the folks that you're hearing today. And I think that it's really upon us to really create avenues of opportunities for folks, right? To really be in these places, to really help inform policy, to inform research, to be advocates in our own community of change. And I'll give a prime example. As a person of faith, which I'm not ashamed of, I know what God has done in my life. And my job as a Christian is to multiply what he's given me. And that's how I see my work, and that's how I come into this space, because I took in so much too as a young kid. Being exposed to violence at a young age, we should not be surprised knowing that we know more about trauma and the impact of gun violence than we did 20 years ago. No difference that we think about, when we think about cancer and the treatments that we do now, the science that we use to inform our work, our practice there's no difference. And so when I think about, for example, Ready Chicago, and I think about the 1,200 men that we've been able to serve thus far in the last 3 years, which, by the way, these are men that are in programs that are not after school programs. These are not necessarily just mentoring programs. This is identifying individuals that were just like me, when I was 18, 19 years old. These are the men that we're talking about who are driving the violence in our city. The same folks that CRED is working with. Those are the individuals. When I spoke to Eddie Johnson just a few years ago when he was still a superintendent, he said, Eddie, I believe that about 3,000 to 5,000 people are the drivers of violence. And you have, Professor Andy Papacristo who could talk to that, right? Like, we know who these individuals are. And British Chicago is targeting them, but instead of arresting them or scaring them straight, what we're providing is abundance of resources. And that starts with two fundamental things. It is the cognitive behavioral therapy to help address some of their trauma and to help them navigate, because most of our shootings that are happening in Chicago, unlike the 1980s and early 1990s, most of our homicides and shootings are as a result of impulse. People are reacting. The reason why we found 11,000 guns in our city, last year through the police department, is because people don't feel safe in our communities. And not to mention that at the end of the day, the folks that we're working with too, they've been marginalized within the marginalized. It's not enough to talk about race and equity, because within that race and equity, particularly with Black and brown folks, there are still some marginalization that's taking place that we need to figure out a way, how do we continue to engage them? There's a reason why 80% of the folks in Greater Chicago have only completed a 10th grade level, and they're actually reading at the 6th and 7th grade level. So how can we expect to put them into a workforce? That means that we have to take them, we have to further develop them, we have to also acknowledge their trauma, which again, this is something that Senator Durbin has been really big about hospitals. What is their role? And how do we get street outreach and other frontline providers to provide them with the technical support, right, to start carving and peeling off that onion so that we could direct them to the services they actually are required, not only on the individual level, but at the family level as well. And the workforce, Arne, I would say jobs, it matters. It's part of their identity. People are still trying to figure out their identity. Their identity is not just a street corner or just not from a particular part of the communities, right? Their part of their identity is what we provide for them. And a lot of it is through education. A lot of it has to do with the work. And so we have to find ways to include them. And again, the last thing that I would say is that we know what works, Arne. We know what works because we've seen through our partnership with the University of Chicago's Crime Lab that we're seeing 24% reduction of victimization, and we're seeing over 70% reduction of those in Greater Chicago versus the control group that are less likely arrested for murder or attempt murder. That's over 70%, Arne, based on our early results.
Thank you so much, Eddie, for sharing. And there are 5 pillars to our work at Chicago CRED. We have a street outreach team that recruits young men and women into our program. We have an employment team that helps folks find jobs that he talked about. We have amazing life coaches. We have an education team. We've had well over 100 guys get high school diplomas, which has been amazing, and a set of folks in college. But the fifth pillar, and I could make a pretty compelling case, maybe our most important pillar, are clinical services. And we say all the time that both two truisms that, hurt people, but when you help people heal, you don't just help them heal, they can then help heal their families and the community. And Dr. Tyler leads our clinical services and just does extraordinary work with his team. And Dr. T, if you could just sort of talk about what, not just a day, but often a lifetime of chronic exposure to violence and trauma, how does that impact the decision-making of the young men and women that you're working with?
Yes, sir. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all about these issues and about the young people that we work with on an everyday basis. Essentially, continuous exposure to trauma, particularly when you're talking about gun violence, can change the way a person's nervous system functions, particularly as we're talking about the stress response, right? And so under normal circumstances, whenever a human being perceives something threatening in the environment or coming from themselves internally, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, right? And so it does its job of preparing the mind and body for defense or escape, or to somehow deal with the threat, right? So if it's a mild or moderate threat, the best response is to connect with other people to resolve the problem, right? But if it's a threat that's immediate, if it's a serious threat to life and limb, right? And then the sympathetic nervous system becomes fully activated, right? And so these are the experiences where, of course, adrenaline increases, heart rate, blood pressure increases, the muscles are prepared for action, et cetera, a whole cascade of events that prepare the person to defend themselves against the threat or to take action to avoid it, right? And so, but under normal conditions, after the threat passes, right, you go back to normal functioning, especially if you have a group of people who provide adequate social support, right? But if you live under conditions where serious threats are constant, right, it can change the way that the nervous system functions. And so we work with young people who on an everyday basis, when they leave the house, they have to make sure they have their weapon and that it's loaded, right? Because at any moment they could run into a group of people or individuals who are their mortal enemies, right? And they become mortal enemies because they've been at war for 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, right? And, we're not talking about people who live somewhere, in Iraq or Syria or someplace, right? We're talking about people who live right here in Chicago, in South and West Side neighborhoods. We're talking about young people who live in other cities, even a city like I'm from Akron, Ohio, a small city, where there are neighborhoods and blocks in the city of Akron where young people have to be armed when they leave the house, right? Because they may run into conflict, right? That becomes deadly, right? So these things happen on a daily basis. So if you can imagine living under those circumstances, right? Where this group of people who've been killing your close friends and family, and you've been killing theirs for years, and they live a couple of blocks from you. Imagine what that is like to leave your house every day under those conditions, right? And so the way it changes the functioning of the system is that persons become hyper prepared to go into full survival mode. In that full survival mode, the thinking center of the brain is offline, if you will. It's not active, right? And this is adaptive. When if a person faces an immediate life threat, it's adaptive to act and without thinking, right? You don't have time to think if it's a significant threat, right? Right. But what happens over time is a person remains kind of caught up or locked into that way of functioning on a daily basis, right? And so small things sometimes get extreme reactions, right? And so again, when they're in this full survival mode, the thinking center is not active, right? And so that makes decision making difficult, right? Right. And so what becomes important is that the person be able to reduce their arousal, right? To be able to manage the risk in their environment, right? So they don't fall into this state of operating, right? So they can begin to think and make clear decisions. So that's what the impact is on people under these type of conditions.
And just the skills that you and the team teach, is amazing how many of our men talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and how it helps them make better decisions, not just in the community, but I've heard guys say it's made them better partners to their partners at home, that they think and they slow down, and they breathe, and it doesn't just help them stay alive. It's a life transforming opportunity, and so critically important. Thank you. Just quickly, quick follow up. I said earlier, we all do this work for very personal reasons, and you're a pretty private man, but the George Floyd, murder impacted us all in different ways. But after that, I didn't know, you sort of said you were in a very similar situation as a young man, and that's part of the reason you do the work you do every day. If you could just sort of quickly share that story and how that impacted you, please.
Sure, absolutely. And so I was 24 years old at the time, 30 years ago. It's amazing that much time has passed, quite frankly. But I witnessed some police officers arrest a young woman in a manner that was clearly abuse of power. And I reacted by questioning the officers about what it is they were doing, why they were arresting this young woman, why they handled her with the type of aggression that they did. And one thing led to another. And because of my socialization in my community growing up, I wasn't going to let anyone put their hands on me, be it police or otherwise. And so I reacted. And so I began to fight with these police officers. But eventually they subdued me and handcuffed me and put me on the ground face down with my hands behind my back, very similar to George Floyd. And then they proceeded to inflict really torture on me. So although no one was on my neck, and I won't get into all the details, but while I was prone and helpless, they administered as much punishment as they could. And so that was the beginning of a number of changes. And that was only the first incident for me that year. There were two other encounters after that with police that also ended, the second one ended with violence, and the third one close to it, right? And so, but going through things like that causes you to think quite a bit about who you are and what's going on in your life and in your community, right? And so it caused me to reflect on a lot of things, including a lot of the young men who grew up in my neighborhood, who had a lot of the problems like the young people we work with here in Chicago. And so I decided to, be a part of the solution in terms of the things that impact our communities adversely, including the way young men are socialized, including the type of traumatic experiences that they have, et cetera.
I appreciate you sharing that. I know it's not easy to talk about, and the issue of violence, whether it's community on community or community and police, continues to haunt us. And unfortunately, tomorrow here in Chicago, for folks not from Chicago, we have a video coming out of a police shooting of a 13-year-old young boy, less than 100 pounds, Adam Toledo, who was shot and killed last Monday. And I'm worried the video may be pretty devastating in what it reveals, and what violence that triggers in our city next year. Our team has spent all day trying to figure out what we can do to try and be helpful there. But these issues, 30 years ago, but as unfortunately, tragically, as relevant today as it was then. And we have to somehow, get to a better place, all of us together. And finally, let me go to Andy Papachristos, who's just been an extraordinary partner, just having someone of his national reputation and background giving us honest feedback, objective evaluation, challenging us every day to get better. Having that outside viewpoint, but expert viewpoint, has been critical. And Andy, two things. You've just done seminal work around sort of a network theory, and I tried to sort of allude to that early on. And you would have been amazing in the pandemic space now with COVID, because you understand this stuff so well. But for an audience maybe not versed on this and how violence like the pandemic travels along social networks, if you could sort of explain your theory there and why that's so important. And then maybe the larger second question is just, why as we do this work, why is it so important to have data, to have objective analysis, to have that academic understanding, and so that we're not just acting upon our hunches or intuitions or our best thinking, but have that real clarity of thought?
So thanks for the question, Arne, and let me just say thank you for having the opportunity to speak with the panelists. And I also want to thank my partners in Chicago for continuing to engage in the work and allowing me in the space to contribute where we can. And so what Arne was mentioning in terms of the importance of networks is actually, taking what we know in neighborhoods and what neighborhoods have known for centuries and trying to see how science can amplify some of that information. So most interpersonal gun violence is about relationships, it's about networks, it's about disputes and situations. And we know a lot in science. We're not starting from zero that can help us understand these things. And something that Eddie had alluded to, which is that in Chicago and in about a dozen other cities in this country we've looked at, even within communities that have high levels of gun violence, it's usually a small number of individuals who are actively involved in those disputes and situations that lead to the shootings and fatalities. So part of what we've been doing, in our part at N3 at Northwestern is trying to help amplify some of these efforts by understanding who's in harm's way, and like Ready Chicago and CRED and other organizations in the city and across the country, trying to figure out how you can leverage the neighborhood experts, those messengers, those people with lived experience who know those networks, right? They know the networks in ways that I could never know those networks. They know the relationships that go back years. They know high school affiliations. They know group affiliations. They know current romantic relationships. But we can leverage that information for intervention. And by the way, those same networks can be leveraged for harm as well. And so I think what we're seeing across this country, and especially that we're witnessing firsthand in Chicago, is making sure you amplify that neighborhood expertise. You bring in, and to Arne's second question, the importance of science is that we're actually not starting at zero. We actually know a lot. There are people innovating in this space. There are people evaluating and researching the space. There are people that are bringing local knowledge, state knowledge, federal knowledge to try to unpack where we're having the greatest impact. And I want to say a couple of things which were alluded to, but I'll say them directly. So one, yes, we have increasing evidence of programs that are working to reduce violence. But second, part of the investing in this space is our investing in a profession and a jobs and training public health and public safety professionals that have been disinvested in for centuries. That is so critical to this effort to make sure we invest in these spaces. And we're seeing that pay off. We're seeing that pay off in certain communities in Chicago. And that's one of the biggest parts of this conversation, and making sure that those voices that are on the White House include Eddie's and Pastor Mike's and others, Erica Ford, the people that have been doing this work year in and year out. And for those of us that feel we can also contribute to make sure we know when we can step up and when we can step back.
I'll stop there. I just want to thank all of you for your honesty and leadership and commitment to this extraordinarily difficult but extraordinarily important work. And just quickly before we shift to the other panel, do any of our congressional leaders or senator any quick questions for the panel? And if so, if you have some, we'll answer them very, very briefly, very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Susan Lee for the second panel. But Congressman Schakowsky first, and Senator Blumenthal. Go ahead.
I did. So, Eddie, I just wanted to congratulate you. You've come a long way, and it's just wonderful to see you. I'd love to reconnect with you. I'm just so proud of the work that you're doing, and thank you so much. It's good to see you again. And I just let me thank the entire panel. The combination of these personal stories and talking about how we resolve these issues is just so incredibly important. So thank you so much. And the leadership of our Senate colleague, Senator Blumenthal and Durbin and Robin Kelly. I don't know if I can stay the whole time for the next panel. I'm going to try to, and if you don't mind my having my soup, I'm going to continue with my dinner, but I really want to hear you. So again, thanks, Eddie.
Senator Blumenthal, yeah, question? You're on mute. You're on mute, Senator.
Thank you. Just a great big thanks to you, to CRED, Leo Smith, who has been instrumental in planning this gathering, and to Robin and Janice. These stories are so powerful. They are so very moving. And I just feel honored to listen to this panel. I have to jump off now, but Eddie, I was in the Rose Garden with you on Thursday, and you know, what struck me, I came back home and I said to my staff back in Connecticut, you know, the loudest applause was for community violence intervention aid, that $5 billion. And this conversation brings home to me again how important your organization, Arne's, Andy's, how the grassroots organizations, you know, we overuse grassroots, but I mean community organizations are really making it happen. And you are providing a beacon of hope. We haven't really met before, but I would be honored to continue our conversation as with many of you here. And thanks to my congressional colleagues, but most important to the community activists and advocates who are on this call and, you know, literally keeping hope alive. So thanks so much to everyone.
Thanks so much for your leadership, taking the time. Congressman Kelly?
Yeah, just so many thoughts are running through my mind, but one thing is the lack of Black and Brown folks in the counseling mental health profession. You know, I'm the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, and that's something we talk about all the time, that we need to get more providers of color into the profession. Because there's been so many studies done that people do better when it's people that look like them or understand the reality, you know, of their situation. So I think that's so important. I want to thank Tiana for sharing her story, you know, as, you know, a young person, but thank all of you, and really for Diane and Eddie. You know, we need to continue to lift you up, and you're right that you need resources. I know you've touched so many people and changed so many lives, but there's so many more to change. And if you had the resources and things that you needed, then you could do that. And I know Diane's been trying to put together a tech center. And I always say nothing stops a bullet like an opportunity, whatever that opportunity is to that, you know, person. And so hopefully this, you know, this community money will find its way, you know, to great organizations like, you know, both of you have, so that you can do more.
You know, thanks so much for the opportunity. And again, I think the stories of individual transformation are unbelievably powerful and moving and important, but we really have to raise our collective aspirations and move from individual transformation to neighborhood violence suppression. And that is really a scale game. And we are not working with enough young men and women anywhere, not even close, a small percent. And until we commit and use public and have public resources to put behind that public good and reach at scale, we're going to continue to struggle. But again, in a dark time, I'm absolutely convinced that if we touched enough men and women, we would see a dramatic reduction in violence. And that's what this really conversation is about. And that's what potential resources coming from DC and the White House would be a game changer here in Chicago and across the country. So thanks to all of our panelists. We'll shift to our second panel. Susan Lee, my colleague, will moderate that. We recruited Susan and one of her colleagues from LA, because in Chicago, we have to do this work with great humility, because we haven't been winning as a city for years, and other cities have done much better. And Susan was a real leader in LA and had seen them significantly reduce their violence. She came and worked with us for a while. Then she went over to work with Mayor Lightfoot as her deputy mayor for public safety for about a year, and is back in our team at Chicago CRED. But Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Arne. Thank you, everyone. The first panel was awesome. Hopefully, I can do a justice to this panel of distinguished leaders on the second panel, who have been working in the field of violence reduction nationally and locally for decades. The collective wisdom that's represented spans a wide variety of sort of skills and experiences around organizing, around community practice, coalition building, multiple US city and international initiatives, as well as federal expertise. And so I'm going to take a slightly different approach than Arne. I'm going to engage each panelist individually and introduce and have a dialogue about their work, but their thoughts really briefly, and then pose a sort of a general question that everyone can interact in. And I do encourage all the panelists to sort of build upon what you hear from other panelists on the panel. So I'm going to start with you, Pastor Mike, because you know, I think we've heard a lot about community power and the need to build up power, and you have been organizing around this issue for a long time. You're the founder and lead pastor at the Way Christian Center, but in West Berkeley, but really you've also led this sort of Live Free campaign, and most recently really instrumental, as Eddie mentioned, in engaging the White House on this dialogue around the $5 billion and moving forward, lifting up the community interventions that need the resources, as we have been saying. As you know, violence manifests itself in a really very local way. Every place is different. Oakland is different from LA, from Chicago, and so forth. And something struck me when I was listening to Reverend Barber recently, when he talked about all organizing efforts must be led locally. And so I just wanted to, having this rich experience that you have around both local and national organizing around violence reduction, how do you see the role of community level organizing within this national moment that we're in, to lift up community level, community-based violence intervention efforts?
Well, just deep appreciation to Representative Kelly and the whole squad over there in your office that have continued to create these opportunities for us to come together, and to Susan and Eddie and Fernando and Tim and all the comrades. It's great to be here. I would just quickly say, the pain that we feel locally around the loss of lives related to guns is intergenerational reality of trauma. And that has forced us to really ensure that our response does not happen in a vacuum. People have lots of distrust, they have lots of fear, they have lots of anger, they have lots of pain that have historically only been responded to with punitive and more traumatizing approaches. We found in our cities across the country where we really tried to see this work: Oakland, Stockton, Camden, New Jersey, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Indianapolis, Indiana. Although all of these different communities had a different experience or contextual experience of violence, we found lots of through lines. And those through lines were, it's a small number of individuals who are driving lots of these incidents. And these individuals are outside of institutional spaces, meaning they are often on their own trying to resolve lots of these conflicts. The political powers that be have not figured out how to respond to these loved ones with a lot of care, compassion, empathy, and concern. And so our organizing locally had to first transform us as faith leaders and as individuals who are working on the ground every day. We always say that the first revolution is an internal revolution, our own revolution inside, helping us to appreciate that if we are hopeless around solving this issue, then we will buy into the hopelessness that is as deadly as a bullet. Our organizing put people into spaces we would never exist in without the shared commitment to resolve these issues. And that shared space constructed not just strategies, but relationships and a mutuality that allowed us to build the political power to bend the will of elected leaders, of law enforcement leaders, and of community members in a direction they were not prepared to go. But over time, because we kept showing up, I think we were able to literally not only reduce the gun-related shootings and homicides in multiple cities at the same time, but bend the power of government to make sure that can be a sustained effort. And that is the power of organizing. I believe it is the singular tool that communities have still in our tool belt that has proven over time to be able to deliver the results that we seek.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. I really appreciate that. That's so true. And I turn to Guillermo as sort of you and I have done work in LA. You obviously did this work in New York, and you brought this transformational, really family systems approach to City of LA's work. And to Pastor Mike's point, basically jurisdictions have to adopt this approach of a community-based approach in order for the entire city to change. And you've done this work in LA, in City of LA as the deputy mayor. and then you went to Central America, and now you're the chief of violence prevention in the city of Oakland. And so my question to you is, as jurisdictions take up the mantle, bend to the power of the people as they organize and implement these strategies, what is the top 3 best practice that you have seen jurisdiction-wide being implemented that others can take lesson from? And certainly, I share, having just been the deputy mayor in Chicago, I'm here to learn. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Susan, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Pastor Mike. And top 3 practices, I think that I will start by saying that individual programs really should be embedded in a broader comprehensive strategy. Some of Andy Papa Cristo spoke about it. That comprehensive strategy does include data. It includes a relationship network that Pastor Mike was talking about. And it includes the ability, in my opinion, to intervene at an individual, peer, family, and community level simultaneously. So once we have that structure, then we can dig down a little bit deeper into programs. And again, I want to emphasize that programs don't play themselves. Models don't play themselves. They're like a piece of piano music. You put it on the piano, but you really have to put in effort each day. So these models don't work by themselves. They require a tremendous amount of energy and a tremendous amount of relationships. For me, what I've learned by working domestically and internationally is that I've learned from both. I think in LA, we did start to really test this idea of a place-based data-driven strategy. And within that, I think one of the areas that became something that I was very drawn to is the idea that we in the field of violence prevention have left families behind. Not families like mom, dad, 2 kids and a dog, but whatever family structure exists. And we have left them behind by insisting over many years to walk in through the door to catch families doing something wrong. So the LA model of being focused on families is actually just the opposite. It's about catching families doing something right and emphasizing that. So that model was exported to Honduras, El Salvador, 3 countries in the Eastern Caribbean and North Africa. And there, because there are higher levels of violence and lower level, a much smaller number of programs, we found that the emphasis on family became even more important. So I would say the top 3 for me have become the place-based approach, which is a comprehensive strategy that all of you have mentioned. 2, emphasis on strengthening families in 2 very specific ways. One is how to accompany families in their mission to protect all of its members. And we have found that families, irregardless of what they look like, are capable of doing that. And the other component of family strengthening has to do with multi-generational traditions that get passed down that serve to build resilience. So that's place-based strategies, family, and the last is the sort of redefining of of public spaces from one in which we have historically excluded people based on their identity. And so LA has a particularly long history of making the mistake of attempting to attack the identity of gang members. And all he did essentially, that's what the war on gangs was based on, strengthen the identity of gangs. So one of the strategies that LA used was to use data to determine when violence was occurring. It was occurring Wednesday through Saturday, 7 p.m. to midnight. Pick the public spaces, and they turned out to be mainly recreational facilities where the violence was occurring. And rather than trying to push gang members and isolate them from concentrating, LA did the opposite. And it opened up public spaces during the summer, during the times of the year and the days of the week that violence spikes, to actually bring the entire community together. So redefining the concept of stakeholders to include everyone, including those who might be likely the victim of violence or the one doing the harm. Some of those practices are being now transferred to Oakland, California, to strengthen the tremendous work that was already being done in Oakland by Pastor Mike and other folks. So we are continuously adapting practices, best practices. And so when you say the three best that I have found, I think adaptation has to go in line with that. Programs cannot be adopted, just drop from one city to another. So I'm constantly learning.
Absolutely. I share that sentiment with you, also having worked in multiple jurisdictions on this, and I completely agree with you on the need for a comprehensive strategy at a city level. But as Pastor Mike and you have pointed out, it is a very small number of highest risk individuals who are sort of at the center of violence. And to reach those individuals, it really requires what we call in the work license to operate. And many of the community-based interventions rely on people who have street cred, like street outreach or gang intervention, community intervention workers and whatnot. And so Fernando, I turn to you, Executive Director of Urban Peace Institute, because UPI, not only being really at the center as a partner to the city around building the comprehensive strategy for LA, but also has done tremendous local and national work around capacity building within the community, both at the sort of worker level by creating a training academy and professionalization track and a pathway for a career, but also building ground up community-based solutions. And so as you think about some of these opportunities that have been presented with a committed President Biden speaking about community-based interventions and the likelihood of more resources coming, how do you think about the needs for capacity building in the communities that experience violence the most? And what does that look like? How do we benefit from this network of credible messengers and folks who have the relationships and trust to be able to reduce violence?
Thank you, Susan. It's an honor to be here. I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Susan and Guillermo, and of course, Pastor Mike, some organizing strategies to build the field. I think when we're looking at, when you shape policy, I believe in people power. My background is in community organizing. I think you work to advocate to change policy. You can shape policy and get funds to trickle down to the ground level. But I think a lot of times the biggest challenge is really the implementation. And so what we've seen in LA, what we've been able to see in Chicago, we've seen in cities across the country is that how do you begin to implement those dollars? And so in Los Angeles, we're trying to get money down to community-based organizations, but also too, we find out that the capacity isn't there. For example, you have organizations that are great on the ground. They have what we call, as you said, a license to operate, but a lot of times they don't have that administrative capacity and the support in order to administer dollars. The baseline for us is that intervention workers, peacemakers, they need to be paid a wage that allows their family to thrive. So that's bottom line. They need funding because they're putting their lives on the line. We're even asking for hero pay. But the capacity to develop peace, I think many times is overlooked. How do you build capacity of organizations in order to administer, whether it's federal funds, philanthropy, et cetera? How do you draft RFPs that come from the federal level that do not increase barriers? What we found in LA with the CARES Act funding is that they did not allow administrative costs, us to charge for administrative costs. So it was very difficult to get community-based organizations involved in that because they need the cost covered. What we built in Los Angeles was the Urban Peace Academy in partnership with the city, the LA Violence Intervention Training Academy that certified gang intervention workers utilizing standards of conduct and practice in order to professionalize the field. That was key as well. Our first sister academy is in Chicago now, the Metropolitan Peace Academy. We have a symbiotic relationship between both cities, and part of what LA has done and what we've seen Chicago do is really invest in utilizing private dollars to build out infrastructures that are going to allow the profession to grow and support one another. So part of what we really focused on in Los Angeles was really not only how to do the work, how to recruit people to be out in the streets and define what intervention is, but also building infrastructure to support them. It's not enough to get money down to the community-based organizations. They need ongoing training and capacity, just as any other profession. As lawyers, doctors, they have to get their licenses. They have to go through continuing education. It's no different for our field. And we're trying to build that field out, but making sure that we are connected to the ground and that folks who are working on the ground are maintain their effectiveness and connections to the streets.
Thank you, Fernando. And I'm going to turn to Tim, who is a senior program officer with Joyce Foundation, who is one of the leaders that have pulled together the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, which is a coalition of 50 foundations that really invested and took the lead after the murder of Laquan McDonald and, you know, the violence spike we saw in 2016, and that coalition has continued of those foundations. But Tim brings also great federal expertise, having worked with several congressional leaders and having been the managing director of the Guns and Crime section of Center for American Progress. And so I'm going to pose you a little bit of a fissure question, which is, you know, in this very critical moment, as we're seeing a groundswell of demand for change, both in terms of solutions around, you know, really lifting up community violence prevention, but also like around police accountability and police reform, as we see these continued troubling cases. The movement at times has been divided or siloed, I guess I would say, between folks who have advocated around gun safety or gun accountability issues, and those folks who have worked on everyday urban violence, community level interventions and whatnot. And so how do you see those two things being complementary, that they are solutions to solve the problem as a whole, rather than one or the other? I guess, how do we get to the yes and part of bringing those two sides of the same coin together?
Thanks, Susan, for the question, and thank you, Congresswoman Kelly, for inviting all of us today for this discussion. I've really appreciated it, and all of the folks who have offered their comments. You know, Susan, that's a tough question, and you know, for years, you know, it's no secret that a lot of the national gun violence prevention organizations have been focused on questions about easy access to firearms, the proliferation of guns, which is a little bit of a different conversation than what we've been having here, focusing on some of the community-based solutions that you identified. About the importance of intervening with those that are at higher risk and addressing the dynamics that cause young people to carry guns, you know, in the first place, which is also, you know, a high risk decision. And in many respects, I think actually that these policy solutions that we've been talking about have over time and very recently really come to complement one another in a couple of different ways. Number one, I think that the dialogue between some of those national organizations and some of the community-based organizations that we're talking about have informed each other's views about these policies. Case in point, a lot of national organizations that are working in this policy fight are much more now focused on discussions about risk. And risks of firearm ownership and risks associated with access and those who are at risk of doing harm or being harmed. And that in and of itself, I think, has strengthened the policy solutions that they have been advocating for at the national level. And in turn, I think that what they have been talking about has strengthened what has been happening at the state and local level. Like this issue about access to firearms and the proliferation of guns is hugely important to communities in and around Chicago when we look at the number of illegal firearms that are flowing into the region from out of state. So to your question about, you know, how do they complement one another? I think that the two sides of those coins have dramatically improved the policy options that are now at the table. And in so doing, it's developed a greater sense of consensus. Whereas many of those national organizations are glad to be at the table pushing for that $5 billion figure that the president announced just last week. And many of the community-based organizations are very happy to see new research initiatives about trafficking of firearms and the sort. I think those connections are stronger now, and that really is, I think, how these organizations have complemented one another.
Thank you, Tim. That's really encouraging as we move forward, because we need to sustain the momentum of this surge that we're seeing. So I ask all of you, now that you've really shared your areas of expertise and your thoughts, you know, we have a rare audience with some congressional leaders here. And so what would you like to see congressional leaders and the federal government overall do more of in order for us to be able to build the right solutions so that we are not seeing Black and brown young people dying on the streets every day. What does the federal government and our congressional leaders need to do here? And you know, anyone can speak, but you know, I know Pastor Mike, you talked about the political will, obviously, the bending the will. So perhaps you would like to start, but I invite everyone to jump in, and we do have very little time, and so just brief would be great.
Well, I am a Black preacher, so brief is not in my DNA, but I will be quick. No. I will say this: we need political champions, from progressive, quote unquote, lawmakers, executive leaders, mayors, governors, county administrators, who do have the power at the local level to literally invest our tax base in a different approach. It is not the case that Republicans are the reason why we don't have these scaled up solutions in chocolate and brown sugar neighborhoods and cities across the country. It is mostly because, in my experience, too many executive leaders of cities do not have the confidence that we could literally save lives without having to use police as a blunt force instrument to make that happen. And so political leadership, political championing of these strategies, trusting that people closest to the pain, the Eddie Bocanegras, the Fernando Rehomes, the Chico Tillmans, the Erica Fords, the Sierra Walker, who I got a shout out, who leads our Live Free Chicago work. These folks have strategies that work. We just got to give them the resources, give them chances to both succeed and stumble, right? And I think that will allow us to be able to literally take the $5 billion that we believe is coming, touch your neighbor, and put it in the right hands on the ground.
Thank you for that. Tim?
Yeah, Susan. Yeah, thank you. You know, you asked, you know, what are the things that they could or should be doing? I think it really lies with specificity. And what I mean by that is, you know, last week we talked about the $5 billion proposal that the president put on the table. He also at the same time said, hey, I want to take the 26, you know, different grant programs that are out there across 5 agencies, and I want them to prioritize a gun violence solutions. Now, what I think Congress might consider doing is try to provide more specificity on the front end of those programs to ensure that those dollars find their way to the programs that we've been talking about tonight and the ones that Pastor Mike was just talking about. I think Burn Jag is a perfect example of this. You know, there has been hope, there has been general attempts to try and get Burn Jag to be diverse in how they spend those dollars. But at the end of the day, you know, some studies find that only 5 or 6% of those Burn Jag dollars are going to violence prevention efforts. Most go to general law enforcement efforts. Not to say that law enforcement doesn't need resources. I think many different public services need resources, but I think because those law enforcement agencies have in their bloodstream, their lifeblood, they know where to get those dollars. They are at an advantage over other organizations like the ones that we're talking about. And until we carve out or dedicate those funds more specifically with that specificity, I think that advantage is going to exist in perpetuity.
Truly fair point. Chief.
Yeah, I would say fully in agreement about the specificity. And one of the things I like to put on the table is it's based on some data from Oakland, which is, you know, we've had in Oakland over the last decade, 70% of homicides have been African Americans. And of that 70% of homicides, only 40% have led to an arrest. So in essence, we have lots of mothers in lots of communities in Oakland that don't know what happened to their children. So every time there is a shooting in Oakland, this trauma gets reactivated. Therefore, it is very difficult to mobilize communities without addressing that trauma. So I would like to see some of, while we put out the fire with the people that have their fingers on the trigger, we also have to fireproof by working with these mothers that have been left behind, these families that have been left behind that keep reliving the trauma. So specificity, I would agree with that. And then in terms of political will, I think part of our job is to really force political will by being effective about what we do. I think it's much easier to get a lawmaker to take credit for a solution than for a problem. So we have to really bring to the table what we know and what's effective, and see building political will as a constant process. Specificity and political will, agree with both of those things that we need to do and what our role is in it.
Last thought, Fernando, before I turn it over to Representative Kelly.
I would just add that the enforcement of laws does not generate public safety. So we can't look at public safety just as a law enforcement issue. And so broaden that idea out. Just because you're enforcing laws does not generate safety, does not make people necessarily feel safe. And so as we broaden that out, two quick stats from Los Angeles to share. Gang intervention in Los Angeles has helped reduce retaliatory violence by 41% in South LA over a 2-year period. And this is one that I really like, is that when law enforcement, LAPD responds to a gang-related homicide alone, the chance for a retaliatory homicide to occur is 26%. When LAPD and gang intervention in their separate lanes respond, the likelihood of a retaliatory homicide drops down to less than 1%, to 0.7%. So I guess the message is the work that we do nationally, it works. People need to understand that as a part of a community-based public safety, as a part of public safety, that these programs, these strategies work, it's been evaluated, and they need to be invested in. And for us, when federal dollars, they come to counties and cities, we have to advocate for them. We need to put together advocacy groups, we need to write letters, and we need to organize. And we're always going to continue to do that. But also we have to stand up intermediary organizations that can receive federal funds directly and get them out to community-based organizations that have the relationships, that know the networks, know how to grow new organizations to ensure that the dollars are not tied up into any of these bureaucratic systems where we have to lobby for an audit to understand where the money went, where it's hiding, and if it's hidden in probation budget. So intermediate organizations, I think, are going to be important to stand up as well as part of a federal strategy to get dollars out to our community.
Thank you. I just want to really appreciate all of the panelists for their great thoughts, and I turn it over to you, Representative Kelly, and thank you and appreciate you for creating this opportunity. Representative Kelly, you're on mute.
You would think I have Zoom down pat by now, but I want to thank you, Ms. Lee, for moderating the second panel. But before I close, I just wanted to give my colleague a chance if she had any quick question or quick comments. You, Jan.
No, the last two speakers, well, Father Mike and Fernando, were talking about these alternatives, and I think everyone on the panel really was. Trusting that these interventions work, that trusting the communities takes trust on the part of municipalities, elected officials, who are not only going to have the vision to see how these interventions work, but then also to help fund them. And so it's not just changes on the part of the people in the communities, but it's law enforcement, it's elected officials who maybe haven't seen enough of the evidence yet, or haven't given the evidence a chance. And I just think that's so important. So organize, I think is really right. And I appreciate that. I feel like a little turning of the switch in my head as well, that if we're talking about efficacy, things that really work, then we have to count in all the work that's being done on the ground, grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for joining us. I want to thank all of you so much. We do things like this because we are trying to get the word out about what does work, and to show as many people as possible. Fernando, when I visited Karen Bass in LA, she took me to meet some of you guys from the successful programming that you're doing. It was a little bit ago, but she's very proud of the work. And I know Mayor Lightfoot came out to LA also to see, what you guys were doing. But thank you so much for everything. This is so important. And, I'm going to continue to push. I know Jan's going to continue to push for resources to get to, programs, as Jan said, that are working, and we need to help get the word out of the programs, that are working, and to build that trust, because it's going to be on the ground that we really make the difference. So thank you guys. Have a good night. Thank you, Arne and Leo. Appreciate you, and have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.